So it is my deep honor to welcome Professor Adriene Beltz to this seminar series. I've had the pleasure of knowing Adrienne for some time, and I'm just your biggest fan. By way of introduction, Dr. Beltz is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Michigan, where she directs a research group that uses network analysis techniques to study how the brain mediates sex hormone influences on behavior over the lifespan, really. And so she uses these really clever, kind of intensely longitudinal designs to model dynamics in the brain and behavior over time. And some of that work, I'm guessing, is going to be covered in today's lecture. Before Michigan, she earned her PhD and postdoctoral fellowship at Penn State. And she is a decorated scholar, teacher, and mentor. I'm not going to have time to read through everything, but just to highlight a few, she is a recipient of the Brenda A. Milner Award from the American Psychological Association, also earned an APA Rising Star Award, and the Anne Anastasi Distinguished Early Career Contributions Award, also from the APA. And as if that weren't enough, she also received the APA Mentoring Award. She's received awards for her teaching excellence as well. So truly across all marks, she's just this incredibly rigorous and creative scholar, mentor, and colleague. And I'm just absolutely delighted to welcome her here to the seminar series and to sort of bring her into the fold of the Women's Brain Health Initiative. So without further ado, Adrienne, please take it away.
Oh, sorry. Just a real quick bookkeeping. If anybody
Yes.
wants to ask a question, please enter it in the Q&A and we'll address it at the end so that we have a good flow for the YouTube posting. So, yep, please put it there.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. Emily, thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit about my work today. It's really exciting to be associated with this initiative. So today I'm going to talk about hormonal contraceptives and behavior. Can you see my slides all right? Yeah, looks good. Okay, great. The potent state of the nascent neuroscience. There's not much on the neuroscience, so I'm going to talk a lot today about really the behavioral neuroscience of hormonal contraceptives and where I think the neuroscience can go from here. And so let me start with some perspective. About 10 years ago, I was in graduate school and I was studying prenatal hormone effects on behavior, really the organizational effects of these gonadal hormones during sensitive periods of brain development. And while I was studying prenatal hormone effects, we learned of some important work by Cheryl Sisk and colleagues who are now down the road from me at Michigan State, where they were looking at puberty as really a second period of brain organization or reorganization in animals, particularly in Syrian hamsters. And the premise of this work, and this is the hamster lifespan here, so don't be shocked about age being in weeks, but the basic idea was that the brain has declining sensitivity to hormone exposures, these gonadal hormone exposures with age, such that if an animal would go through puberty earlier, the brain would be more sensitive to those hormone effects at that point in development compared to, say, an animal who went through puberty later. So basically, the window was open more widely. That would mean that for any behaviors where that hormone exposure, and the earliest work was in males and had to do with testosterone, so that for hamster behaviors that testosterone played a critical role for, these behaviors would be even more sex-typed or sex-typical for those who went through puberty earlier than those who went through puberty later. And Cheryl has a bunch of compelling evidence on this, and even in some female animals to show that this really seems to be the case. Others have done similar work as well. We were really wondering if this was also the case in humans. So we looked at some adolescents, well, actually in early adulthood and into middle adulthood, to see if boys who had gone through puberty earlier than their peers had more sex-type behavior on some skills where we know androgen exposures, for instance, seem to be important, like mental rotations. And we found that that was the case. In fact, males who matured earlier seemed to have better mental rotation skills, even into early adulthood, than those who matured later. And others have replicated this finding since. We didn't see any effects for girls, though, not with mental rotations and not with other cognitive skills where we think estrogen seems to be important, skills like expressional fluency, for instance. And so we were wondering if the reason we didn't see effects in girls, and this is small effects across the board, but if one of the reasons we didn't see effects in girls is because, well, we've got the menstrual cycle going on, and we're retesting folks in the right moment, where the organizational effects kind of overshadowed by activational ones. And we thought, you know what, we'll get a quick glimpse into what's going on by looking at hormonal contraceptives. Right? We'll see what it's like when basically exogenous hormones are controlling the menstrual cycle, figure that out, and come back and answer this question. Well, like I said, that was over 10 years ago, because when we went into the hormonal contraceptive space, we realized that question was not so easy to answer either. Because at that time, and to some extent, it's still true today, that there's really small samples in this space. We know a lot of, in a small sample research, we see a lot of type 1 errors, even when we see real effects. Replicating them requires even larger samples, so this was challenging. We learned, and folks like Pletzler and Kirschbaum really made these points early on, that not all hormonal contraceptives are created equally. They have different mechanisms of action. They have different hormone types and levels of hormones in them. And that heterogeneity is very challenging to parse. It's probably not a case of pill users versus not, in many cases at least. In the methodological literature here, we see things like measurement, grouping in terms of who are we comparing hormonal contraceptive users to? Is it naturally cycling women? At which phase of the menstrual cycle? Who are we recruiting? What type of selection criteria do we have in terms of past pregnancies and other types of gynecological problems? It was really across the board here, so it's hard to find some consistent conclusions. And data we finally published is that most studies didn't actually confirm hormonal contraceptive pill use, or in this case, oral contraceptive pill use. We went back through some of the data I collected earlier in my career and found that without confirmation, say by talking to folks over the phone or having them bring their pill packet into a test session, about 40% of women will give you inaccurate information about their pills, not intentionally. They just thought they were using that pill, or they thought they had that dose. And sometimes the inconsistencies are, of course, larger than others. Sometimes just the dosing is wrong. That's a lot of the time. But about 10 to 15% of the time, it's that they're using a completely different pill on a completely different hormone profile than they thought they were. So given this questionable quality, it was hard to find some converging results. Things seemed to emerge, but my, oh my, in the past 10 years or so have things changed. We've made a lot of scientific progress as a field. We have some very large, we even have population-wide studies now on hormonal contraceptive use. We have experimental evidence in humans and in animals. For the longest time, there wasn't even animal research on hormonal contraceptives because it was common practice to gonadectomize the animals and then administer hormones. So what does it look like if you administer hormones with gonadally intact animals? We're finally, great folks are making progress in this and both have viable mouse and rat models in this space. Across the past couple of years, there have been a ton of special issues. I'm going to take this opportunity to broadcast my own. So if you've got awesome hormonal contraceptive data using innovative methods, consider this outlet that Benedetta Lerner and I are working on together. Benedetta's handling the animal work. I'm handling the human studies. Feel free to email me about it. Back to our regularly scheduled program. We're still making progress. We've got foundation, federal sponsored workshops and initiatives like this one, right, are really taking us to the next level in this area of research. But hormonal contraceptive research has always been laden with socio-political complexities. When I started this work, there was a lot of conversation of, well, what if you find out something bad about hormonal contraceptives? Well, then I was like, well, you do better. But there was still a fear to engage in this space. And this has only increased in the past couple of years since the Dobbs decision. concerns about abortion pills won't be the only one restricted by state bans. There's actually an active, like, anti-birth control message in general being spread in many places. And a lot of the work that we do isn't nested within nuance or within some of the positives of hormonal contraceptives, and only the negatives are focused on. I can keep going. In Gen Z and even other trends, say on Facebook, there's a lot of concerns about negative side effects of the pill, very real, very negative effects that folks are experiencing, this kind of alignment of your brain on birth control, as if it's not a natural or appropriate thing. Again, emphasis on the negative and attacks that could threaten access. Some folks try to poke fun. This is Taylor Tomlinson talking about hormonal contraceptives. I'll let you listen to a clip. Oh, it clicked. Hang on.
I'd love to get off birth control because I'd love to meet me, you know? I've heard that when you get off birth control, you're just like, has anyone in here gotten off of birth control? You have right here. Oh, a lot of us. Okay. All right. How did that go for you? I broke up with my boyfriend. You broke up with your boyfriend of 6 years.
So there's a lot of conversation about this in that space. Of course, there's some response to this. Lovema, the birth control brand, has an AI response that might be useful to hear.
Hey, it's me, Lovi, the AI avatar created by the contraceptive pill brand Lovema, here to help you navigate the world of contraception. If you've been following the trending hashtag getting off birth control, you may have seen a ton of videos from women sharing their stories of how hormonal contraception impacted them, both physically and emotionally. This is a quick reminder that choosing birth control is a personal decision because everyone's body and health needs are unique.
And then I was like, oh my goodness, do I agree with AI on this one? So lots of interesting stories and very real experiences and a lot of complexity. But let's remember here that we shouldn't throw out the pill with the packaging, right? It's a basic right to decide freely on the number, spacing, and timing of our children. And often when we're thinking about perhaps risks or these negatives of pill use or hormonal contraceptive use that have been highlighted in some of the clips that I showed you, they're often compared to not using hormonal contraceptives or being naturally cycling. They're not compared to the real risk, which is actually the risk of unplanned pregnancy. And so how do we consider that type of risk? And we always need to remember that hormonal contraception plays a huge role in health beyond contraception. Dysmenorrhea, amenorrhea, polycystic ovary syndrome. I'm doing a lot of work with folks in pain management lately, and just trying to understand if we have cyclic, uncontrolled, chronic pelvic pain, what does that mean for how the brain organizes about the experience of pain in general? And when hormonal contraceptives are a way to interrupt that pain or the transfer of that pain into something that becomes more chronic and widespread, this is vital. And there's a lot of positives in this space too, right? Luxembourg has free contraception, British Columbia, free contraception. Did you know in the US we now have over-the-counter oral contraception for the first time? It's called the O pill. It came out earlier this year, I believe. Look it up. I looked it up. $20 for 28 pills. You don't need a prescription for this. So things are really changing, and there's a lot of opportunities and positives in this space. So given all of this complexity, folks, and including Emily here, we got together, we put our heads together. We said, well, what does all of this say about the brain? And how does hormonal contraceptives, how does it matter for how the brain looks and functions? And we toiled over this and really figured out that in this world of black and white messaging, we're firmly in the gray when it comes to the neuroscience of hormonal contraception. And I guess we agree with AI when we say only individuals, together with their trusted healthcare professionals, can possibly do the complex calculus required to determine whether to use hormonal contraceptives or not. And so the goal of the talk today is maybe to give you some insights into that complex calculus by reviewing the state of the nascent neuroscience on hormonal contraceptives. I'll talk a bit about what's known, highlight what we need to know about links to human behavior. I really will be largely in the behavioral neuroscience space with this, so that all folks with uteri can be empowered to make informed, personalized choices about their healthcare. I'll note that not everybody who menstruates or has a uterus identifies as a woman, and not everybody who identifies as a woman has a uterus or menstruates. Yet in this particular space, most of the data we have available is on cisgender folks with uteri. So when I'm reviewing those studies, I'll talk about women, but think it's really important to highlight how the work we're doing here can represent folks who use hormonal contraceptives for a diverse set of needs. I'll give a brief primer on what hormonal contraceptives are and how they work to make sure we're on a similar page, and then give you 5 what I think are takeaways of the current state of the science. So hormonal contraceptives are widely used, up to 400 million women worldwide. Here's 2022 United Nations data. You can see down there in the light green, 150 million pill or oral contraceptive users worldwide. That's actually less than the number of IUD users worldwide up there in orange. That's 161 million, although it's unclear how many of those IUD users are hormonal versus, say, copper IUDs. In the US, I've seen some recent reports that about 75% of IUD users are hormonal, but I will say folks in the studies in my group, it's a much higher percentage than that. Also notice injectables, another form of hormonal contraceptive, or implants. Here some of them are things like the shot, that's like a Depo-Provera shot, or the implant you might know by the name Nexplanon, mini pill, hormonal IUD. All of those are progestin only formulations. Some are short acting, some are long acting like the IUD, whereas other forms like the ring and the patch and the combination pill, they tend to have both ethinyl estradiol or another estrogen. It's usually ethinyl estradiol, and some progestin, and they have like about 3 weeks on, about 1 week off, or placebo. Most data we have concerns combination pill use. It is the most combination pills, or the pills in general, are most widely used in the US and Europe, and that's probably why we're seeing this. So to focus on these most studied oral contraceptives and their combined formulation, like I said, that's usually ethinyl estradiol and some progestin. This is basically what's going on. We have the start of the cycle through about 28 days, and there you see hormone levels. They're all relative and kind of peaks and valleys. And basically, in a combination pill, you'll get a constant dose, at least in a monophasic one, of ethinyl estradiol for about 21 days. And then some progestin for about 21 days. In a biphasic or triphasic, it's usually the progestin dose that'll shift or increase for 7 days at a time. Importantly, these hormone doses, or these synthetic hormone doses, are relative. We know that they're largely strong enough to inhibit ovulation. That's how oral contraceptives work. They inhibit ovulation. They basically suppress ovarian function completely or in large part. But what their active hormone levels are and how that compares to endogenous, say, estrogen or progesterone in the system, that's quite unclear. There's some relative rankings. Some folks are working in like mass spec to figure these things out, but it's still quite unclear. And so that's really an important takeaway from this research. Is that it seems like maybe there's some more potent activities of these hormones, but it's not quite clear. So against that backdrop, what's our first takeaway from this literature, at least the first takeaway I'm going to offer today? And that's these oral contraceptives have different formulations. I said we don't know how the hormone levels really compare to endogenous levels. Those progestins also vary from each other a great deal. There's different types. You might have heard of progestin generations, for instance. And by leveraging that information, we can get some insight into different aspects of oral contraceptives that matter for different behaviors. This is really kind of leveraging the fact that oral contraceptives are a natural experiment. Folks are walking around, and for 21 days, they take this dose of an estrogen and a progestin that we know, and then they stop for 7 days, right? So we can leverage some of this information to see what may or may not matter for behavior. So given all of these differences and challenges in measuring the synthetic hormone activities, our first study on this topic, we actually grouped oral contraceptives according to their active pill ingredients as specified by criteria specified by the US FDA. So here's one group of pills. I put some pill names there, common pill names there that might pique your interest. These are all monophasic pills. They have ethinyl estradiol, and their progestin is norethindrone acetate. Here's another group, triphasic pills. Ethinyl estradiol is constant across 21 days, but norgestimate, that progestin, it increases. It has 3 different doses before the 7-day placebo pill. And here's another group of pills, ethinyl estradiol, monophasic again, and drospirenone. This is the newest generation of progestins. And actually, all these generations of progestins have different androgenicity as well, right? Many of them are derived from androgens. The synthetic form are derived from androgens, and that's why they also have some androgen binding as well as their progesterone receptor binding. And so in our first study on this topic, we compared 2 of those pill types against men and naturally cycling women in those good old spatial skills that we started talking about early in the slides. So here's the 3-dimensional mental rotations test by Vandenberg and Cuse. Perhaps you've seen this or used this one before. The goal of this test is to match that target image on the left to the accurate, or I guess the responses on the right. 2 out of the 4 of them are accurate rotations of the target image in 3-dimensional space. To pick those 2, it's actually this 2. This task shows a particularly large gender difference. And when we just grouped naturally cycling women and oral contraceptive users together, compared them to men, we basically detect this gender difference. You know, men are outperforming both groups of women on this particular task. But when we broke apart those pill users into, based on their active ingredients, those FDA specified active ingredients, we actually found that those using norethindrone acetate, the more androgenic pill, were outperforming naturally cycling women by a little bit. And those using norgestimate, the more mildly androgenic pill, were not. Others have looked at folks taking drospirenone and found that they tend to perform at even lower levels. So these findings are consistent with those other studies, as well as early work on androgens and spatial skills, like the pubertal timing example that I gave earlier. So the first takeaway was how we can really leverage information about pills to understand behavior, or what hormones might matter for what behavior. The second takeaway is that heterogeneity in pills and people is quite important. So we already have some sense of heterogeneity in pills, but let's expand on the idea of heterogeneity in people to start. There's something from Nash. It was called the sex role mediation hypothesis. I think today we'd call it the gender role mediation hypothesis. And it was basically a mechanistic explanation for gender differences in spatial skills. And the idea is that masculinity, or self-perceptions of masculinity, actually account for the gender difference in spatial skills. And an interesting extrapolation of this hypothesis is then that individuals who perceive themselves more masculine, regardless of their sex or gender, would actually have better spatial skills. And this has been replicated across multiple studies, including one of our own, where we have here on the x-axis self-perceptions of masculinity, On the y-axis, that same mental rotations task, and we see for naturally cycling folks this positive relationship. I'm showing you the raw data here, but we've also repeated these analyses accounting for things like general cognitive ability and age, for instance. And we see small effects. These are the types of small effects we work with in complex human behaviors. We wouldn't expect them to be large effects. But we didn't see any effect when we looked at oral contraceptive users. And we wondered if there was something about their hormone exposures through oral contraceptive or ovarian hormone suppression that explained this effect. So in this case, we wanted to move away from some of those codings. So the groupings that I talked about earlier, those are important, having these homogeneous groups, but pills are also really, really heterogeneous. And so if we're only going to look at like homogeneous pill groups, we end up with smaller and smaller samples, and it's harder and harder to find effects, or at least to even meaningfully look for effects. But using some information in this particular book that's by Richard Dickey, most hormonal contraceptives, most pill types, their hormone activities, estrogenic, progestational, and androgenic, have been examined in other tissues, in other animal tissues, or sometimes in human endometrial tissue for their activity levels to basically figure out relative rankings, or even in some cases exact rankings, of which pills have more or less of those particular hormone constituents. For instance, here's a pretty common pill, at least it has been in our samples so far, Loestrin FE. And if we look at those kind of low, medium, and high rankings in the Dickey book, code them on this 1 to 4 scale, where 1 is low activity, 4 is high activity, we can get these, again, kind of relative rankings or codes for very different kinds of pills. And if we code all the pills in this way, instead of using those groupings, it actually allows us to include everybody we have in a sample. And we can look at those different hormone activity levels and their relations to behavior and their interactions with each other in ways that we couldn't before. So we can also look then at how highly correlated androgenic, progestational, estrogenic activities are. And here you'll see in this particular sample that we had that estrogenic activity was negatively correlated with androgenic and progestational, but androgenic and progestational weren't really correlated with each other. I can tell you that in other samples, we see different patterns of correlations here. And I think that's really important to mark or to think about in terms of what types of pills are being used in what communities of individuals and how that's changing over time. This type of coding scheme gives us some leverage and insight into that. And so when we use those rankings to try to understand perhaps why there wasn't a relationship between masculinity and mental rotations in our pill users, we actually found effects for low estrogenic and high progestational activities. So women using pills with low estrogenic or high progestational activities, we're seeing some small positive relationship between masculinity and mental rotation scores. Again, I emphasize that these are small effects. Outcomes or skills like mental rotations are complex and influenced by lots of things, but for some people, hormones matter. Moving on to takeaway number 3. As a trained developmentalist, I can't help but think about time, and time really is of the essence when we think about hormonal contraceptives and things like depression. This is where we've seen a lot of media exposure and attention when it comes to hormonal contraceptive use. So epidemiological studies on depression, again, about 10 years ago, this was a conclusion from one of the key ones, that actually hormonal contraception could reduce levels of depressive symptoms among young women, and systematic investigation of these exogenous hormones as a preventative factor in psychiatric epidemiology is warranted. That's very different from the headlines that I was showing you earlier today. And after spending some time and thinking about these studies, what the conclusion was is that, well, people aren't randomly assigned to pill use. Oral contraceptive use might be a natural experiment, but it's one that people aren't randomly assigned to. So That means that folks, for instance, who continue to use hormonal contraceptives might be evidencing what's, called the survivor effect. They don't have negative side effects. So for some folks who don't have negative side effects, they'll be the ones who are most likely to continue using, and they might differ from folks in other ways, folks who don't continue using. It's also really important to remember in so many of our studies, as I was alluding to earlier, that hormonal contraceptive availability and use has changed over time. What access individuals have to different types of pills or information about them has really shifted from decade to decade, right? Like we just saw with the O pill, which is now available over the counter in the US. So across that backdrop, we've learned from other epidemiological studies, population-wide ones coming out of Denmark, for instance, is a curve like this. This is a Skovlund study that I think many folks are aware of now. And this is basically showing for different types of hormonal contraceptives there. These are the different colored lines at different ages, which are on the x-axis, and rate ratios or risk for depression diagnosis or SSRI prescription following 6 months of the start of use. These are the rates of increase that we see. And, across the board, there's some risk, especially for 15 to 19-year-olds, and especially for, the levonorgestrel IUS, the intrauterine system or intrauterine device. We see this heightened risk. Some folks have said it's really the progestin element that seems to confer risk. Others have kind of interpreted this as it's the non-oral forms of hormonal contraceptives that seem to confer risk. Other studies, including a population-wide study in Sweden and data with UK Biobank, have generally come to similar conclusions, especially when it comes to IUD and younger users. Although it's important to note that the UK Biobank data, this is a place where time really matters. Those data are much older than the data that we're seeing come out of Denmark and Sweden. Biobank data are from users in the 1970s, where pill types and characteristics were quite different than they are now. But I don't think this is the whole story. This is an important part of the story to remember, but I don't think this is the whole story, because for folks who then continue to use, maybe it's the survivor effect, or maybe there's some sort of transition to use. That makes sense when we think about hormone transitions at other parts in life, right? Puberty, menopause, pregnancy, whenever we have periods of massive hormone transitions, some risk is conferred during the transition, but our bodies and our biologies adapt, and then risk for many folks decreases after that. And that's actually what this same study showed, that after use, 3 to 6 months or 6 to 12 months of use, that's where we really saw the heightened risk. But after about 4 years, we actually see the risk ratio declines and is significantly decreased for folks who continue to use for longer periods of time. And that was also seen by those UK Biobank data. Even though, like I said, those data were older, we have the benefit of seeing kind of longer term outcomes related to use then. And there, they also saw that increased risk when use had begun within the past 2 years, so increased risk of depression. But folks who had been using for a while, we don't see those same increased risks anymore. So to me, this suggests something about the transition to use and something about a changing HPA, HPG axis surrounding that could really matter. It also makes me think that maybe, given those developmental trends, we weren't so far off 10 years ago when we were thinking about adolescent reorganization, right? Because now we were seeing that individuals who were starting hormonal contraceptives, especially IUDs at younger ages, are those at the greatest risk for maybe some reorganization, kind of longer term effects. And we need to do more mechanistic work on this. And I will say once again, I can't get past this important point about, well, why are adolescents starting to use hormonal contraceptives? If it's because of dysmenorrhea, if it's because of PCOS, if it's because of chronic cyclic pain exposure when somebody is an adolescent, we know that that type of exposure and leaving it untreated when it's very easy to treat in most cases with hormonal contraceptives, if leaving that untreated sets somebody up for risk for chronic pain or pain sensitivity for their whole lives, then we have to consider that in the context of this perhaps increased depression risk, which is maybe something that we can understand and monitor and kind of work folks through a transition if after that transition there's going to be a likely kind of placating or even protective effect. So all of this to say development matters, the changing brain matters, the timing and duration of use matters, and we have to contextualize all of this within an individual's own experiences and symptoms, and be careful about making broad sweeping claims as if this is the only thing going on in somebody's body or life. Takeaway number 4, the specificity of effects. So not all behaviors are impacted by OCs. I've given the example of mental rotations. We've talked a bit about depression. There's other behaviors that we haven't talked about today, but there's also some that don't seem to be impacted by hormones. These include shifts, large-scale shifts in personality or gender self-concept, right? We can think of big 5 type personality measures. We had a study where we looked at this. Were naturally cycling women and pill users different in these different aspects of big 5 personality? No, they weren't. Did it matter what type of pill they were using? No, it didn't. Did it matter how long they were using that pill? No, it didn't. We replicated this in a separate study, and others have replicated this in a European sample as well. They found that naturally cycling women and hormonal contraceptive users didn't differ in personality. They did find, though, that IUD users were a little bit more likely to be extroverted or agreeable than OC users. I think, again, potentially suggesting or consistent with the point I was making earlier about how hormonal contraceptive patterns change across times and in different localities. Here's another way in which hormonal contraceptive users didn't seem to differ from others. So in an intensive longitudinal study, over 100 men, naturally cycling women, and OC users, we had daily surveys about feelings, experiences, cognitive skills. They responded, for instance, to the positive and negative affect schedule every day for 75 days. And then we grouped together, right, the traditionally negative affect items, irritability, nervousness, hostility, the traditional positive affect items. And we were really interested in whether their affect fluctuated, how their affect fluctuated across these 75 days. This is another place where oral contraceptives provided a really compelling natural experiment. If women are excluded and have traditionally been excluded from scientific representation and studies because their fluctuating hormone levels kind of compound and confound all types of experimental effects that we're looking for, we could see in oral contraceptive users where those cycles are actually held constant. We could see if those fluctuations really do matter for things like affect, because we see them fluctuating in naturally cycling women, but kind of held constant by the exogenous hormone modulation in OC users. So we use these data in order to answer that question. We focused on multiple aspects of daily variability. I show one here called emotional volatility, where here you see an individual whose positive affect didn't fluctuate so much. This was calculated by an intra-individual standard deviation. And then someone else whose positive affect varied a great deal. Their intra-individual standard deviation was much higher. So after we captured, again, not their levels of positive and negative affect, but how much they varied over time, we actually found that users of different pills had daily variation, both in positive and negative affect. Similar to naturally cycling women who were similar to men, here's the raw data. Evidence for similarities were on average almost 3 times greater than evidence for differences. And if anything, it looked like there was less variability in some of the groups of women than some of the groups of men. And why this seemed to make a very compelling case to me. It's not saying that hormones don't matter for emotion. We know from other work, hormones can matter for emotion in some people in some contexts, but that we're not seeing a wholesale kind of shift in emotional variation patterns linked to the menstrual cycle or linked to oral contraceptive use. And yet the conclusions that came away from that really weren't about the nuance of pills. It was more about how men and women's emotions are. Men and women ride the same emotional roller coaster. Men are just as emotional as women. We're debunking stereotypes, okay, right? Then things started to get away from us a little bit. Don't cry. This became a topic on some talk shows. I'll give you a clip.
Men or women?
Men.
Oh, a new study from the University of Michigan found that men are just as emotional as women. They followed a group of 142 men and women over 75 days, and they found little to no emotional differences between male and female groups. Erica Cobb, take it away.
Then everybody says whether they agree or not. This continued in other platforms.
Cyrus, this is a bogus study because if
Oh, I'm glad you said that.
because if they showed differences, that would be sexist and stereotypical. So every study has to show that we're all the same.
Yeah, because it's factually impossible to say that men are emotional as women.
People continue to say whether or not they agree or disagree with the state of the findings. It's just a shame that they all miss the point about oral contraceptives being the control that provides the inferences. Number 5, last takeaway. There's so many opportunities for future research, both kind of zooming out and zooming in, which is something we talked about, that review that I mentioned earlier in the talk as well. When we zoom out to make generalizations, this is something that we can do together in large initiatives, big samples, and it helps us see what's going on kind of systematically and in a representative way. We also need to consider equity, and we need to move beyond. We've talked a little bit about IUDs, but other types of hormonal contraceptives as well. Most of our literature is on oral contraceptives. You see light green there. That has to do with the pill. The top bar is 1995 rates of contraception use, and the bottom bar is 2020 rates of contraception use, individuals 18 to 45. Or women 18 to 45. And you'll see pill use just dominates in Europe and North America, and that's what most of our literature is on. You'll see things like IUD and orange are becoming more prominent. You'll see that other things like the injectable are much more widely used in Oceania and Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance. These are shots that are given about every 3 months. An important thing to consider with those shots is these aren't necessarily slow release then, right? It's a dose of progesterone that's given once that lasts 3 months. And so side effects when you're given a massive dose at once are likely to be greater than if you have some sort of slow release option. And here we see IUD use is actually the most common form of use in some places like Eastern and Southeastern Asia. So we really need to think about what hormonal contraceptives folks are using and how all of these different types of hormonal contraceptives have different actions. When we focus on pill use, we're talking about ovarian hormone or ovarian suppression largely, but hormonal IUDs don't necessarily seem to suppress ovarian function. Their contraceptive action is more localized by changing cervical mucus, thinning the endometrium. And so there's some exogenous hormone and endogenous cycling hormones at the same time. That's a completely different hormonal milieu than we're seeing in pill users. So we really can't group hormonal contraceptive users together in the same studies, and we really need to think about how we can understand some of these effects in other folks. were using different types of contraceptives. So thinking more about IUD use, this is a place where I've been and my group has been for a while. Post-Roe, we saw headlines like this: could IUDs be banned? That came out 3 days before the paper I had been working on in this space about intrauterine devices being a new frontier for behavioral neuroendocrinology. I will say in those past 2 years, it's been a smidge over 2 years now, it really is looking like there's something unique going on with IUD users, right? They seem to have these unique hormonal milieus. I just explained why in terms of their contraceptive action, but from some of the endogenous hormone levels we have in some of the studies we've published, their patterns of correlations in say estradiol and progesterone and testosterone are just different wholesale than what we're seeing in pill users. We saw earlier, I mentioned these personality differences, not largely between non-users and hormonal contraceptive users, but that IUD users a little bit more, say, agreeable or extroverted. In our studies, IUD users tend to be a little bit older and have higher rates of education than our pill users, for instance. Some recent studies have actually shown dose-response relationships with depressive symptoms in IUDs. We talked about things like the Skovlin study where IUD users had the most increased risk for depression diagnoses. But there's lots of different forms and doses of IUDs. There's Mirena, Skylena, Kylena or Skyla, Kylena, and they all differ in terms of their dosing. And some of that has led to some detection of dose-response relationships. Again, effects are small, but they seem to be there. And emerging data from my group suggests that IUD users do tend to have better mental rotations performance than naturally cycling women. Again, this is something we would expect given that the progestins used in IUDs, levonorgestrel, are highly androgenic, and they're present without the suppression of ovarian function. I also want to take this moment to say, thank goodness that the CDC is finally considering pain during IUD insertion and now recommending that it's a conversation that physicians have with folks who are considering this method. Last point then, we're zooming out, we're thinking about different countries, patterns of use, different types of hormonal contraceptives. We can also zoom in and think about individuals, or maybe put the I back in ovarian hormones. So if we have these types of curves here, we'll say we've got naturally cycling women performing something like a stress response, hormonal contraceptive users. And when we typically, in a lot of our studies, we just look at the means of these groups and we'll say, there's more of this in the naturally cycling women. But there's a whole bunch of hormonal contraceptive users just in normal distributions who are performing or scoring above the average naturally cycling woman. And there's naturally cycling folks who are performing or have scores below the average of hormonal contraceptive users. So to answer some of these types of questions, we need to think about our data differently. If we have a whole bunch of variables on the x-axis, people on the y, lots and lots of measurement occasions, what we normally do is focus on one measurement occasion, same people, same variables, look at this between person space, but instead let's focus on one person, all those same variables, but at those many, many time points, like in the 75-day study I showed you, right? We can get physiological assessments that do this, these 75 days. We can do repeated in vivo testing or even functional neuroimaging, right? In functional neuroimaging, we have pictures of the brain every second and a half or so. And we can do these types of personalized analyses. And so preliminary data from my group looking at IUD use and mental rotations in this space, we're leveraging a slow event-related design where we're actually comparing not mental rotations to fixation, but three-dimensional rotations to two-dimensional rotations. There's kind of good evidence that the part of the sex or gender difference that we're seeing in mental rotations has to do with the transition from two-dimensional to three-dimensional space. So we compare those images. When we do, we see kind of like a mental rotations network or regions of the brain that have been shown to play a role in mental rotations, and a default mode network. They're overlapping with that 3D, 2D contrast. And when we do some personalized imaging, if folks have interest in this type of personalized analyses, we can basically do functional connectivity analyses where we identify at a group level connections among these 10 regions that are important for most people in the sample, iteratively estimate them for everybody. And then we identify more connections, kind of using those group level ones as a prior. We'll identify more connections iteratively for each person. And so we end up with basically a functional network of connections that were important for everybody, that were important just for this person, but they're all estimated uniquely within the context of this person's data. You can do this in R, for instance, through the GIME package. And when we do this with our preliminary or early data of IUD users, we get these types of personalized networks. And when we have these personalized networks, we can then use some like traditional graph theoretic metrics, for instance, to say, okay, what's the density of the default mode network in this space, or the mental rotations regions in this space. And we're seeing some encouraging results, but we're waiting for the rest of the data to come in. So in conclusion, hormonal contraceptive use is a vital part of reproductive health for hundreds of millions of people, but we're really living in a time when these data are just coming in. We're getting some consensus maybe on some behavioral studies, but things are still pretty wide open when it comes to brain data. Nonetheless, we can think about hormonal contraceptives as a natural experiment for how exogenous hormone formulations or ovarian hormone suppression influences behavior, like we saw that example for androgenic progestins and cognition. We see that individual differences, like folks' own perceptions of their masculinity or femininity, matter for mental rotations performance in this case, and how that can be modulated to a small degree by hormonal contraceptives or OC use. We see there's links with depression, but they really depend on time. They depend on the age of the users, they depend on duration of use, and they really need to be contextualized within individuals' reasons for use. Oral contraceptives, hormonal contraceptives don't impact all behaviors. We wouldn't expect them to. And we need future research. We need to equitably generalize our inferences to all users and to accurately map the unique neurobiologies of individuals. If we can inform practitioners so they can help make some individualized suggestions, empower users so that they have the information they need to make the best choices they can for their own personal health, well-being, their own unique circumstances. Thanks to anyone who's ever talked to me ever about hormonal contraceptives, thanks to funding, thanks to iterations of my lab who have played vital roles in collecting all of these data. And if we have some time, I'd be glad to chat.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. There's already questions pouring through, and if you have questions, just throw them in the chat and I'll help moderate. But I'll just say thanks for taking what is an incredibly complex topic and giving a structure to it so that the science can really advance. I'll just dive right in. So Natasha says, fantastic talk. Thanks so much. Regarding IUD users and personality, is the hypothesis that their personality differences are driven by the type of hormone, or that their personality differences drives them to choose the IUD? Chicken or the egg?
Good question, right? So is personality kind of a personal characteristic that leads someone to select? So are folks selecting into IUD use? I'm pretty sure the data from the particular study that I cited, the Pletzer et al. Study, I think they were cross-sectional. So I don't think we can empirically disentangle that right now. But for most folks, the hypotheses about personal characteristics are actually that they would lead someone to prefer, say, OCs or IUDs over something else. There's not compelling research, in my opinion, broadly for gonadal hormone influences on things like personality. So I think personality is kind of considered as a selection characteristic.
Christy asks, whoops. Oh, somebody's okay. Thank you so much for this talk. Was the data from the mental rotation scores collected at the same time point in the cycle for all the women, including those on OC?
I guess it depends on the study. So in some of our earlier studies, no, it wasn't. We monitored time of the cycle, but that's its own really, really complex set of research questions because cycle timing and phases vary greatly between and within people. And so for our hypotheses about organizational hormones, we thought that if these effects are worth talking about when it comes to oral contraceptive users versus naturally cycling women, that we would see effects above and beyond effects of the menstrual cycle. And that's what we saw in some studies. But more recently, we've started through design controlling for time of the cycle. Like in our imaging study, for instance, we focus on folks who are scanned during menstruation, because it's hard to know what phases of the cycle folks are in, but we know if they're bleeding, their hormones are low. And so we went with the sure thing there in those studies.
A quick comment. So many things that I reconceptualized after this talk. Thank you so much. Says Stephanie. Erin says, thank you, Adrienne, for a brilliant talk. Have you looked at the impact of hormonal contraceptives on other cognitive functions, cognitive control, flexibility, reward-related functions? And if so, what have you found?
Yeah, good questions. We've looked a bit at like expressional fluency. In one of our studies, we looked at expressional fluency and didn't see anything really compelling. So expressional fluency would be a task where, like the making sentences task, where you have to have 5 words that you come up with that make a meaningful sentence. And in three of those cases, you're given what the starting letter of the word has to be. So like MRPOJ, and you have to make a sentence that kind of fits that phrase. So we haven't seen much compelling there, although there were some kind of hints of what might be going on. Our most recent studies have really focused on verbal memory, because those are places, for instance, with menopause, where you tend to see cognitive effects. So we've been pretty diligent about collecting verbal memory data more recently, and in collecting like some risk related data, sensation seeking type data, because of strong, compelling animal research on gonadal hormones and those behaviors, and like drug seeking and things like that. All of those data are sitting on my lab servers, and so we'll have answers for you soon.
Just a few more. I know we're running short on time, and I'm going to link our YouTube for the Anna Spowers Women's Brain Health Initiative, because Dr. Beltz's talk is going to be posted there, and we can carry on the conversation. We can direct any comments specifically to Dr. Beltz, so please feel free to ask questions on there. Her talk will be uploaded hopefully later today. But maybe a couple more. Super interesting talk, lots to think about. Are you familiar with any research that's looked at the impact of HCs on pubertal development? For example, how does starting hormonal contraceptive early in adolescence influence pubertal and brain development?
Yeah, good questions. So for the most part, pubertal development, so menarche, when folks would probably be considering hormonal contraceptive use, menarche occurs pretty late in the process of puberty. And so thinking of like hormonal contraceptive impacting puberty isn't too much of a concern, because puberty is just about over by the time hormonal contraceptives would be started in most cases. But I think a lot of, at least my questions related to hormonal contraceptive use in adolescents, are not necessarily about puberty specifically, but about that idea of brain sensitivity declining with age. So if that window of the brain, a brain sensitivity is wider, especially for folks who say go through puberty earlier than their peers, then their window is wider. They've finished puberty earlier and might be starting using hormonal contraceptives earlier than their peers, while that window of reorganization is still pretty broad or pretty wide open. And so that's where I think some of the pressing kind of questions and hypotheses about that topic come in to play. I think we need a lot of really good prospective data on this before I can answer the second part about those impacts.
And last one in the minute remaining, and there's so many more that are unanswered, but we'll send your way, Adriene. Natalie asks, thank you so much for doing this vital work. I'm curious about your opinion on the effects of HCs and lack of cortisol response in behavioral stress tasks and effects on the HPA axis in general.
I think that's one of the next immediate steps this area of work needs to take. I focused on depression, but there's a lot of work on anxiety and related to stress response or this blunted stress response that's seen in hormonal contraceptive users. I think this is a place where animal research could be super vital in kind of pointing the way for us. My sense of that literature in the animal space is that ethinyl estradiol is one of the key players or kind of modulators of that system. But I'm really excited for the animal models that folks are working with and developing. I think they'll point us in the next, help us, like I said, in the human space, take the next step, because when it comes to things like stress regulation in humans, there are so many variables. It's so heterogeneous. We're going to need to be in a personalized brain network data collection modeling space to answer this in humans. And we're going to have to be focused by what our colleagues in the animal space can tell us experimentally.
Okay, there's more questions, but we are out of time. So Adriene, thank you for lighting everybody's sort of minds on fire and for raising some important questions. And hopefully the major takeaway is that there's just a critical need for really more research. So we'll all look to you for how to do that in a rigorous way. Just one more time before we close out, Dr. Beltz's talk will be posted up on the YouTube page, and I encourage you to use the comment section there to continue the conversation. So thank you so much for joining us, and everybody, thank you for joining. We'll see you next month.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.